Hello, welcome everybody, live from the Data Platform Summit in 2022. Thank you, wherever you are around the world, to take the time to continue your education about the Microsoft platform and Azure Data. I'm Bob Ward from Microsoft, a principal architect in the Azure Data team, focusing on anything called SQL. I'm really excited today to be joined by my colleague, Ajay Jagannathan. Ajay, tell everybody around the world here what you do at Microsoft and how this release is special to you.
Thanks, Bob. It's my pleasure to be back again at DPS Summit for yet another year. My name is Ajay Jagannathan. I'm one of the principal group product managers at Microsoft. My primary focus currently is with SQL Server 2022. So a lot of what you hear today is something that we and our team have built and presenting to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Ajay. Hey, a couple of logistics about our session, because we got a lot of stuff to show you today. You're going to have some questions. We happen to have some of our teammates right on the chat session with you to answer your questions live as we go through today's information about SQL Server 2022. In addition, at the very end of this session, we have a slide we'll put up about more resources where you can dive in and learn more about this great release. We certainly want to make sure you get your questions answered. So if the team has something they need to forward to us, they'll put it in the chat session, and we'll certainly try to address it sometime during this session. But let's get going. Ajay, why don't you kick us off and tell us about SQL Server 2022?
Yeah, thanks, Bob. Before we get into SQL Server 2022, here are some resources available for you. If you're looking for the content that we are going to see today, you can go and download it at the link provided below, as well as several demos that the team has built for you to play with SQL Server and get familiar with the product. Now, before we dive into SQL Server 2022, let's take a look at how we got there. So it all starts with our core innovations in some of the critical areas of the product. Several of the features that you will see here were built on the foundation, starting with SQL Server 2016 and even beyond. For example, if you go back to the last 3 releases, you can see here that we have built a ton of innovation in the security, availability, performance space, as well as some of the industry-leading innovations, such as bringing Polybase into the product, as well as SQL Server on Linux, first time ever on a non-Windows operating system. And you will hear a lot of new features today, which are built on this foundation. And yet another thing for you to remember here is, as you look at SQL Server 2022, if you have not used any of these 3 previous versions, this also gives you a good refresher on some of these innovations that you can automatically benefit as they come built in with SQL Server 2022. So with that, let me give you a high-level picture of what SQL Server 2022 is all about. So as you can see in the slide, one of the key value props we want to bring to our customers is bring the value of Azure to our SQL Server customers. On the cloud, we are continuously innovating Azure SQL, as you know, and bringing a ton of value to our customers. So our SQL Server customers want to have the same benefits. It all starts with being cloud connected through managed instance, where you can do things like business continuity, as well as reporting workloads with a one-way replication, as well as migration through a failover. So these are some of the managed instance features. In the analytics space, with the introduction of Synapse, now we are bringing Azure Synapse for SQL, where you'll be able to connect your existing SQL Server instance with 2022 to Azure through Azure Synapse, and then do analytics and visualization through Power BI with no ETL involved. Continuing with yet another Azure value that we're bringing is Purview integration. A lot of customers want to leverage the capabilities of Purview for data insights, data lineage, or centralized policy management. Now, SQL Server 22 brings those capabilities through Purview integration. So it just does not stop with Azure alone. It's completely up to your choice on how much of Azure you want to use. But SQL Server still has several other features that we'll talk about today, even if you do not want to use any of these Azure capabilities. One of the main things I want to continue to highlight is SQL continues to be the most secure database in the planet with the least vulnerabilities, as you can see in the 4th column here. And we continue to invest in this space And another new feature we're bringing for customers is Ledger, which will give you tamper-proof centralized or management of blockchain within your database, which can enable many scenarios. And last but not least, we take pride in being an industry leader in price performance for SQL Server. And we have industry leading benchmarks, which we have published in all scaling factors, 1 terabyte and above, all the way to 100 terabyte. And we are the only database in the industry to achieve that. So no matter any of these features you use, one thing that's common is whether you're running SQL on edge in a hybrid scenario or in the cloud, you will get to leverage the same core engine of SQL Server using your familiar tools and get all the benefits of the product. Now let's go to the more deeper into some of these capabilities. Right. So let me first talk about some of this at a high level. Think of this as the wheel of power, as Bob talks about. So the first one, it all starts being cloud connected. So as I mentioned in the previous slide, we are bringing the power of managed instance, Purview, and Synapse. All the three are fully managed services to your environment where you can leverage this for either disaster recovery, data governance, or real-time analytics. Now, the second category is another extremely powerful capability where customers spend a lot of time tuning and troubleshooting. So this is where we are continuing to innovate in built-in query intelligence through the next generation of intelligent query processing, as well as query store. And we will see some of these features in action shortly. The third category is our core engine, which is what we take pride as a database system in the entire industry by continuing to innovate in security, availability, and scalability aspects. This is what makes SQL Server Engine the most industry proven and trusted for mission critical workloads, and customers are able to get the best out of the product through our innovations here. The fourth category, we continue to invest in other ways for customers to access data outside the database. So we are extending the capabilities of data virtualization and also bringing something new called object storage, which you'll see about shortly. And last but not least is the T-SQL surface area. A lot of our customers who have been using SQL Server for more than 3 decades are comfortable and have been using T-SQL in their environments for everything from application development to management to monitoring. And we want to make sure that customers can leverage all the new features we are adding in SQL Server through our T-SQL surface area, as well as bringing in some new scenarios such as time series and JSON types for new application development. So with that, let me hand it back to my friend Bob to deep dive into the cloud connected scenarios.
Hey, thanks, Ajay. That's a really good way to look at the overall release. I like that wheel of power. I'm going to borrow that one. I appreciate that. Hey, if you think about hybrid as a capability for SQL Server over the years, you might have used something like backup to Azure Blob Storage or replication to a subscriber to Azure Database or something. Some pretty fundamental things. As Ajay's alluded to already, we're kind of changing the game a little bit here. Think of managed disaster recovery now with a managed instance. Think about near real-time analytics with Synapse, automatic changes fed into the Synapse system. Think about ways to go manage security authentication from one spot across hundreds of SQL Server instances. Think about authenticating now your accounts with SQL Server, non-SQL accounts with multi-factor authentication, or using tried and true Defender to look for vulnerabilities and advanced threat protection capabilities. Now, all of these things right here, the core engine's been enhanced to recognize all of it, but we need some helpers. We need Azure Arc agents to help us with AAD and Purview and Defender. We need a self-hosted runtime to help us communicate with Synapse. And we're going to use the power of built-in distributed availability groups to connect to a managed instance. Let's dive into a couple of those. And I'm going to show you a demonstration here live at DPS I've never demoed before for SQL 2022. So we know, and many have told me over the years, that building and maintaining a DR site is extremely challenging. What about scenarios where you hire somebody to do this for your company, they leave and don't leave any instructions? So you can do it with SQL Server. All the capabilities exist there, But it sure would be nice to have a DR site that's just ready to go when I need it, because let's face it, you need a DR site when you need a DR site because of disaster. So what we're doing now in SQL Server 2022 is allowing you to link your SQL Server on-premises instance with a deployed managed instance as a distributed availability group. We're going to harness the built-in power of AGs inside the SQL engine, because guess what? Managed instance is an engine too that knows AG technology. We're going to tie these together and allow you to link them so you can seed your database just like you would seed a database in an AG today. Then this managed instance could be available for read scale type operations, or it could be a passive like DR site. And then if you had a problem, you could actually fail back to a SQL server. Today, what we've been demonstrating is what we call an offline DR scenario, where yes, for the first time ever, you're going to take a backup of a managed instance and restore that back to SQL Server 2022. Very excited about this technology. A lot of customers are interested about it. Can't wait to see you go down the path of seeing if this is possible for you. And you might think to yourself, like, why am I calling it managed? Well, think about this. If managed instance deployed in Azure, Microsoft is backing it up. We own the SLA for the infrastructure and the instance. We do automatic high availability. Everything is there so that, again, when the DR site's available or when you need it, it's just available and ready to go. So you don't have to worry so much about the fact that it's not there when a disaster may strike. So that's Link for managed instance. As Ajay kind of alluded to, by the way, it's available today in preview for SQL 16 and 19 as a one-way migration path as well, if it's something you want to look at, which can provide a very nice online migration scenario to Azure for you. Now, the second part of this conversation is analytics and Synapse Link. So everybody here today watching and listening knows that doing ETL, managing ETL applications can be time-consuming and expensive. And typically, if you're copying data can become out of date. So what we're doing for SQL Server is we're linking together, here's that keyword again, a SQL Server on premises or maybe an Azure VM to Synapse SQL pools in a seamless, connected, near real-time fashion. So therefore, if changes just get done in SQL Server, they show up in Synapse near real-time. And what we mean by near real-time is sometimes a matter of seconds. I mean, my data's there, you query data just like it's in a dedicated SQL pool today. I have built an interesting architecture diagram for you. If you're going to have some sort of intermediate session, you have to have an architecture slide. So let me show you a little bit of the process, how Synapse Link works. So let's assume this gray line, this is your on-premise SQL server to your left with a deployed database already. Again, it could be an Azure virtual machine, but for argument's sake, let's say it's an on-premises SQL server. And in Azure, you've deployed a Synapse workspace. By the way, we're going to be supporting existing Synapse workspaces as well in the future. So it doesn't have to be a brand new Synapse workspace, could be existing one. You're going to deploy a SQL dedicated pool in the Synapse workspace. And then you're going to build something called a link service. The link service is going to connect and tell Synapse for a self-hosted integrated runtime, what is the SQL server we need to be connecting to, using something called a control panel and a control plane, and building something called an ingestion service with Azure Data Factory. Well, that's great. I've got a link service for my SQL server. Now I need a link service, something called a landing zone. That's kind of a more generic term in the industry. We're using it in Azure data storage and Azure Data Lake storage. This is where we're going to store data from SQL Server to ingest into Synapse. So I've got my two link services. Now I want to build something called a link connection based on these services. When I do that, Synapse will tell the host runtime, hey, you know SQL Server, would you run some stored procedures against that SQL Server and tell it to enable the database for linking to Synapse? And would you, based on a chosen set of tables that the user has done in the Synapse link connection, would you seed those tables to the landing zone using Parquet and schema files? And then the ingestion service sees those files in the landing zone and puts them into SQL pools. Well, that's great. What happens next? You start making changes in SQL Server. We have used some of the technology that we built in change data capture and replication inside the server called change feed. Same type of technology, it's a different feature, looks at the transaction log, harvests committed transactions, uses CSV files now, puts those in the landing zone, and the ingestion service picks up those changes and updates dedicated pools. Now, one of the cool things about this technology, just like CD and CF replication, we don't hold up transactions because we know how to figure out in the log where we are to synchronize with this landing zone. And then once data has been committed into the SQL pools for the landing zone, we have smart cleanup jobs to make sure the landing zone doesn't become bloated and too large in size over time. And then, of course, at some point, you can just use the power of things like Power BI to run reports against your dedicated pools. So that's really a nutshell of what Synapse Link is doing for you. So now let's go dive a little bit further and talk about the capabilities of security. Think about Azure Active Directory Authentication giving you multi-factor authentication with SQL Server. Or we'll talk about Purview in a second, the ability to use AAD in a new and exciting way for something called access policies, or Defender for SQL to do vulnerability assessments and event threat protection. So what about Purview? Well, here's an interesting insight or a challenge. You want to get insights, central insights across a bunch of SQL servers, but what would really be nice is to do policies for authentication and authorization against a lot of SQL instances. So let's pick a scenario and demonstrate it. Let's say my colleague, Anna Huffman, who I like, she's building reports for us, so I'd like her to have read access against a bunch of SQL servers, but I don't want to go create the logins in those SQL servers or give explicit permissions to her. And then I also want to invite a guest. Maybe Ajay is going to be my guest consultant that I'm going to bring in that's going to come in there and do performance monitoring for me for like maybe a 6-month period. So I'll invite him into my Azure Active Directory as a guest, and then I'll use Purview to grant him access. I'm going to do all of that without creating logins directly or permissions in the system. And then when his time is up as a consultant, I can simply remove those permissions. Let's see it in action. Okay, so I'm going to start out. I've connected my SQL server to the cloud using Arc-enabled SQL Server technology, Azure Arc Agents. So what I've done is I've connected to the cloud, and what I've done is I've enabled Azure Active Directory through the portal. The portal talks to those agents. It's able to push down information. It's established me, in this case, as an Azure Directory admin in SQL Server, which makes me like a sysadmin inside the SQL Server system. Now, in the same portal interface, I can enable Purview policy management. So it's a click of the button. I put in some information as well, which is called a Purview endpoint. The SQL Server engine, through the Arc agent, knows how to talk to Purview to figure out what these policies look like. So I've got that enabled now. What I'd like to do is go into Purview Studio or the Purview Governance Portal. I need to first register a SQL server as an Arc-enabled SQL server, which I've done. And now we can go create policies. So I'm going to create what's called a data policy first. And this is where I'm going to give Anna read access to my SQL server without explicitly creating a login to SQL Server. So I'll create on policies, then I'll create on access control to give her access to data. And I'm going to build what's called a policy statement. So I'm going to go ahead and give it a name, and then I'll go in and kind of give it a description of this name. And then the policy statement is kind of like a graphical interface to build out what the statement is. So the first thing I want to do is allow Anna to have access, and I'm going to pick read access in this scenario, reading any data in SQL Server databases. And then I need to pick which SQL server. So I'll go here and pick my SQL server on Azure Arc, in this case, the Azure Arc-enabled SQL Server. Click OK. And here I'll pick the SQL Server 2022 that I registered already. Now I got to pick the person. So if I pick subjects, I can go into my Azure Active Directory and do a search and go find Anna. So I'm going to go up. I found Anna in my system. I'm going to save this now. And this will become now a saved policy in my system, which is quite nice. Once I go to the policy, the process of saving this policy, for a data policy, we have a process called publishing the policy. So when I publish it, this is kind of nifty. When I hit the publish button here now, I can pick a bunch of SQL servers to publish it to. I'll just pick one of them. Could be 10 of these to publish this policy down to all of them that are enabled for AAD. So I'm going to go down here, hit publish. Now, SQL Server is designed to regularly poll Purview to find out, like, are there any refreshes in policies? But you have the ability to actually go here and refresh those policies. So I'm going to manually do that now. I'll go ahead and refresh here. And when I do that, the engine now pulls down any policy changes. And so now what I'll do is I think I'll try to log in as Anna and see what happens. So maybe you've done this in Management Studio with Azure before. You now have this option called Azure Active Directory with MFA. I'll pick Anna as the user, hit connect. Now I've already logged with her once, so I've gone through the MFA login process. So once I connect, since I've already done this client, I'll be able to connect to this system. Now, how do I know she has read access? Well, first of all, I'm going to pick a database of my favorite sports team and allow her to query it. You can see here that she can query the database. But notice here, she can't drop it, which shows you she only has read permissions to the system. Now, other thing I want to do is a scenario with Ajay. I want to make him a performance monitor, kind of an admin of my system, but I want to give him sysadmin rights. So what I'm going to do this time is create a DevOps policy. A DevOps policy has an option like, let's go pick the data source type. In this case, it's my SQL server that I registered before, kind of similar to the data access policy. Let me select that. And now I'm for performance monitoring only, which is like DMV queries, for example, I will go search my system and search for the guest account that Ajay is. Turns out he's a big Dallas Cowboys fan. So I'll pick that. That's his Outlook account. Notice it's not my AAD tenant account. I'll pick that, hit save, and then I'll just save the policy. For a DevOps policy, I don't have to publish it. So in this particular case, since this has been done, I can go back to my SQL server, and if I need to, I can refresh, but I've already refreshed in this case. So I'm just going to try to connect as this guest account. Using the same MFA process, I'll connect with the Outlook account, which is, in this case, Ajay is my guest performance monitor admin, and I'll try to go do some operations. So, one of the first things I want to do as a performance monitor is look at some DMVs, see if I can query some performance data. These are some common ones that you might use, right? So I'll hit execute. Sure enough, I can do that. But I don't want Ajay touching anything in this system. He's just doing performance monitoring. So you can see here, if I hit SP configure, he doesn't have permission to do that. Now we have DMVs in the system for you as admins to see what's going on behind the scenes. We have DMVs to see what's possible. What are the possible roles like performance monitoring and read and modify and some of those kind of things? What are the kind of permissions that each of the role have? You can first see that, or you can go over and see who has been given permissions. In this case, these principals represent Azure Active Directory objects in my AED system. Now remember, if Ajay's contract is up, we want to be able to go to Purview and not give him authentication anymore, but not do it explicitly at SQL Server. So I'll go back to Purview now and pick this policy, and I can just simply now delete the policy. And if I go delete the policy, it should revoke access for Ajay as a guest in the system. So let me hit delete. I'll go through now. Now again, SQL is going to pull that policy, or you could manually force a refresh of the policy. And I'm going to try to go back and see if I can connect into Azure, or to SQL Server, with that guest account. So let me go in and try to connect again. I'll pick MFA, the same Outlook account, and sure enough, I get a login failure. So now I successfully, not given Ajay permission anymore because the contract over, but I didn't touch SQL Server to actually make it happen. So think about what I've done, Ajay. I've actually done policy management in a central place. Think if this was like 50 SQL servers. I could do it all for one place, control and manage access for reading, performance monitoring, and other types of access. So pretty nifty technology. What do you think?
Yeah, definitely it simplifies the lives of a lot of folks who have to battle with security.
For sure.
Access. Yeah.
Okay, Ajay, why don't we flip back over now to the engine, and you talk about built-in query intelligence.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. So if you remember the wheel of the power, after the Azure connected features, our next big investment area is in query store and intelligent query processing. So why this, right? One of the biggest challenges, like even several customers face today, and we continuously get feedback, no pun intended, is query tuning is extremely hard and time consuming. So that's the challenge we're trying to solve as a database team. So with that, we are introducing the next generation of intelligent query processing. So I'll talk a little bit about that shortly, as well as the power of query store. Bringing these two product features together helps us achieve the next set of innovations, which will help you accelerate query performance and make query tuning much easier, and in some cases automatic, with absolutely no code changes. So one of the things we are doing is we are turning query store on by default. for new databases. The feature itself has been in the product for many releases, as we saw in the beginning, and the confidence we have gained in the product through advancements in Query Store, as well as millions of databases where it's turned on by default in Azure, has given us the ability to turn it on by default going forward in 22 and beyond. So with this allows us to enable some new features, such as Query Store hints, which you can use to shape plans and require no changes if you're using plan guides. And the third thing is we are also enabling new scenarios for IQP, which will work better together with Query Store. As you can see on the right side, IQP itself was introduced in SQL Server 2017. So now we are going into the third generation of IQP. And some of the common problems many customers have is, how do I tune my max DOP setting? What is the right setting at the server level or a database level or the query level? The second problem space is cardinality estimation. It's an extremely hard problem. We introduced a new cardinality estimator in SQL Server 2014, which works very well for most queries, but there may be few queries which may need to revert back to an older version. How do we make it easier for feedback system to leverage what's information we capture in Query Store and then improve the cardinality estimation? And finally, one of the biggest problems we still see is parameter sniffing, right? And with this, we are trying to basically eliminate this problem where if we have parameterized queries or stored procedures with parameters which may cause different performance behavior, being able to solve that problem and queries being able to execute with predictable performance no matter what parameter you use. And all of these work very well either with Query Store or the new database compatibility level, or in some cases on by default. So hopefully you don't have to turn on multiple trace flags or remember various switches to make or do expensive tuning to make this work, but it'll be getting better and better as we progress. So let's look a little bit deeper into intelligent query processing next generation. So as I mentioned, it's called next generation because this is the third version of IQP family of features since 2017. So what do you get with this, right? First, when you upgrade to SQL Server 2022, we have introduced by default experience for some of the new capabilities, such as approximate percentile. You use approximate queries in scenarios where you're running scans against very large data sets and which are expensive. So the approximate version is good enough for analytic scenarios. So that runs extremely fast with very little resources. So that's available for you now by default with percentile functions. In the previous release, we used approximate distinct. The next one is optimized plan forcing. So anytime a query has to compile, usually when the plan is evicted from cache or if you have a server restart and we have multiple queries are flooding the server and we call this compile storm. It causes expensive resource usage, in some cases blocking and waits on the compile resources. So one of the things we're doing here is making persistence of this compile steps. So that way, if the same compilation step is required, we can just pull it from the query store and use it and thereby avoid the compile storm. The next category is DB Compat 140 plus. Let's say you're upgrading from SQL 2016 or 2017, where we introduced the memory grant feedback features. You automatically get enhancements to these features in the same compatibility level. We tune the algorithm for memory grant percentile, so you get more predictable feedback and the actual grant percentage that needs to be given by the server. Not only that, if Query Store is turned on, you will also get persistence of that feedback, which means if the plan is evicted from cache or if the server restarts, we will be able to pull it from the Query Store and use it for the query. The third and the latest category is available with the latest compat level. SQL Server 2022 introduces DB Compat 160. So with that comes the three features I briefly talked about. The first one is parameter sensitive plan optimization. Hopefully we have saved the world from the parameter sniffing problem with this. So this basically caches multiple plans for the same query with different parameters. In some cases, let's say the query needs a seek, if it's only fetching a few rows, versus if a parameter requires a scan of a table and fetching a lot more rows, we will now be able to persist both the plans in cache, and you will be able to execute with predictable performance for both those queries. The next feature, cardinality estimation, CE feedback. So we persist the feedback in loop in the query store, and we can use that for cardinality estimation. Thereby, you can, with the support for query hints, you will get more accurate cardinality estimation for your queries. And the last one is DOP feedback. This again helps you with better tuning and predictive max DOP settings. So we use query store again to validate and automatically adjust the parallelism needed for your query. So if you started with a very high number, we can automatically dial it down so you're not using all the CPU or resources, where you can get predictable performance with a fewer number of CPUs again. So it doesn't end there. So if you are running with the previous compat level, DB compat 140 or DB compat 150, which are the Gen 1 and Gen 2 of this family of features, so all the features that you see in the middle, starting with adaptive query, adaptive joins, all the way to approximate count distings, will be available to you when you upgrade to SQL 2022 and still stay on the older compat level.
You know, Ajay, as I look at this slide right here, I'm blown away by it. I mean, there's so much stuff on here. I mean, I can imagine the audience is like, wait a minute though, where's the deep dive for every one of these? So I think there are sessions from your team, right, at this conference.
Great question. So we are going through an overview of the breadth of the SQL Server innovations. Query processing is a very, very important space. We have colleagues from the team in the call today, David Pless, Perry, Kevin, and a few more who are not in the call, doing deep dive sessions on these topics. So we highly encourage you to definitely attend those sessions and ask questions, because you will learn a lot from this and make it better suitable for your applications when you upgrade.
Yeah, Ajay, I think at the end of the session, some of those are on-demand recorded ones that your team did, right? So at the end of this session, you have like a table. We're going to call out some of those, right?
Yes, that's correct. Yep.
Perfect. Good. Because I know I'm looking at this going, there's some deep stuff here. I need like Kate Smith to explain half this stuff to me.
Yeah, I mean, you could spend a whole day and still learn more than what's there here.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's talk about the next pillar in the wheel of power, industry proven engine. So Bob calls this the meat and potatoes slide, or this is the core engine. This is what SQL Server has built its credibility on. And this is how we have gotten the industry proven, right? We have customers using SQL Server across every industry you can think of, from banking to healthcare to insurance to retail to e-commerce, etc. You name it, anywhere in the world, SQL Server is very popular because of our continuous innovations for multiple versions of SQL Server. And the three core pillars of our investment here are, first is security. We'll hear more about Ledger, which will allow you to do now, bring blockchain-like capabilities within SQL Server as in the relational database where your data resides, and build tamper-proof scenarios so that you can build reliable protection against your data use and access. And we continue to invest on Always Encrypted, the next version, which will allow you to use hardware enclaves and some of better query scenarios from previous versions for more types of query predicates, etc. In the scalability pillar, our goal is to make sure you can leverage and get maximum performance on high-end hardware. A good example is buffer pool, parallel scan. On large memory systems, we have noticed customers have sometimes issues with scans having either contention or taking a long time. We're invested in the parallel scan feature, which will significantly improve the speed on these large systems. And TempDB, I think we have finally solved years of problem with TempDB with different types of contention we have addressed over the previous releases. And in this one, we are addressing the system page latch contention, which basically means now you don't have to spend hours and hours trying to tune TempDB. In the last pillar, availability pillar, first time we are introducing contained availability groups. Always On has been in the product since SQL Server 2012. but a common feedback we get from customers and community is it works for databases. How about all the other critical server objects, such as logins, jobs, link server definitions, etc.? Just like we do in managed instance, for example. So with contained availability groups, now you will be able to include those server objects as part of your availability group. And when you fail over, all these objects should fail over, simplifying your deployment and administration of HADR scenarios. And another cool technology that we are really proud of and happy to partner with Intel is Intel's Quick Assist, where they introduced a new chipset where you can offload expensive management tasks such as backup compression, which will basically means all the compression can be done through this hardware offloading and acceleration, and your user workload is not impacted, so that the CPU cycles that your user queries need can leverage the maximum without having to worry about maintenance and management tasks taking up the resources. So with that, let me have Bob talk deeper into one of these features with the ledger for SQL Server.
Thanks, Ajay. Yeah, we have some more details even after this slide. I think about some even more engine features that we're doing. We probably could spend, maybe we should let your team do a deep dive on engine features, like what part 1 and part 2 probably during this event. But I think what we're trying to do is give you at least a lot of information to make you get excited about this release, and then try to go dive deeper on what some of these things look like. I'm especially aside in that last slide, by the way, a lot of work by David Pless and TempDB. And my complete hero of this team is Kevin Farley for landing contained availability groups. Really excited to see that technology be part of SQL 2022. So maybe you saw in the keynote, Peter Van Hoff talk about Ledger for SQL Server. And I want you to keep this in mind. If you've thought of the term blockchain before, you've probably associated with Bitcoin mining. And there's no question that technology has been used in that industry, but that's not what it's actually intended for. The whole idea of a blockchain is this statement: tamper evidence track record of data over time. You can actually go look it up and see a definition that looks like that. So it's not tamper proof necessarily. You can't prevent things with a blockchain, but you certainly can get an evidence track record of tampering, which is really important, because what if you have a decentralized authority of data in a decentralized system? It's what blockchains do today. You want to trust the data. All these different parties want to trust something that no one has central authority for. So our Microsoft research team with our engine team got together several years ago and said, that's really interesting. I don't mind this decentralized authority concept, but I need a centralized system, because decentralized systems don't perform very well. They don't have data management capabilities, but there is this thing called SQL Server that has that, or Azure Database has it as well. So let's make sure we understand a little bit about how this works. So you will go into SQL Server, let's say you're a bank. You will create a table and declare it as a ledger table. It's a very simple syntax addition to the create table statement, a little bit like doing a temporal table. We say, I want a ledger table. And you can say, I'd like an updatable ledger table by saying system versioning with that. When you say your table is updatable ledger table, we will build behind the scenes a history table and a view on top of it. Now, this is going to look a lot like temporal to you if you just see this in its own form right now. But there's a lot more to this. There's built-in auditing. There's something called a database ledger, kind of a logical term for system tables inside the SQL database that tie into these things. There are transaction information in these tables that tie into the database ledger. And what's going to give you is a couple of interesting things. Number one, it's going to give you auditing of who made the change, the actual SQL principal, the login that actually made the change, date, time when they made a change, record of what kind of change it was, and then hashing information to verify that no one tampered with those tables. In addition, as part of this hashing mechanism, we build a chain of blocks of these hashes, hence blockchain. Now, what if somebody was clever enough to go in and hack those? Well, it turns out we can record a hash of the blockchain called a digest in a separate trusted storage location. You can do this manually, or you can set up an automation to store this in Azure. Now, why is that important? Because somebody could independently come along and look at the digest and compare it to the blockchain and say, oh, they're off. Somebody has tampered with the data, and information in there as per the digest to find out perhaps even what transaction was the piece that happened that it got tampered with. Now, one of the scenarios that Peter loves to talk about, I've seen him do this before, is multi-party scenarios. What if you have multiple parties? Again, that decentralized trust factor, but you need a centralized system. That's where an append-only ledger could come into play, like a supply chain. I've seen Peter demonstrate this before, where you see you have multiple parties looking at the supply chain. You want to trust the data, but I don't trust anybody to go update the data. So I'm going to make it an append-only ledger table, only inserts allowed. You still have the power of the database ledger, but for example, Buck Woody, who can't, if I gave him DB access, I probably would never really do that, Ajay. But if I did, he came in and tried to update and fake out a row in the table, he wouldn't be allowed to because it's append-only. But I still have this verification process involved here to help me compare data. This is why we call it the power of blockchain and a centralized system. If you haven't seen it, we have a pretty good customer example already out of the gate. Lenovo is using our technology with Azure Database to do supply chain scenarios and authentication for how they build products with their company. So check out Ledger. You'll see sessions here. You saw Peter demonstration of the keynote. I think there's a deep dive session as well for you to see this here at this event. We're kind of excited in our team because we believe Ledger, by the way, for SQL is not just a SQL thing. We think it's a blockchain thing. We actually think industries out there are hungry for blockchain technologies, but have some deficiencies. And we think that Ledger for SQL Server or Ledger for Azure SQL Database could be a great solution for them. Now, Ajay mentioned a bunch of engine stuff. And when I put this slide together, I literally went through the what's new section and I listed all this stuff out. And I look back at this and I talked to a lot of the team members and I go, why did you do this? Why did you do that? Hey, where did this come from? Where did that come from? And did you know there's a story behind all of this? This is not a bunch of people sitting in the back room somewhere saying, I think we'll do more granular to fix server roles. No, this is us knowing we need least privilege, more granularity into security in your system. This isn't even all of it. Did you know there are some 25 plus or more engine features, major engine features in SQL Server 2022? And in our documentation, which I have a resource in this presentation you can look at, you can just see a laundry list of them. You may look at this list and find something that could be a feature you've been looking for, been asking Microsoft for based on feedback to our team. And our deep dive sessions that we have will talk a lot more about these, but go look at documentation. You can find out more, for example, what advanced vector extension is all about and why it might actually help you. Now, I'm going to let Ajay finish at the end and talk about T-SQL, but first let me talk about data virtualization. So you may remember back in SQL 16 and 19, us bringing on this concept called Polybase. We decided that it might be pretty cool if you could access data that doesn't live in SQL Server, sometimes in other formats, but still use the power of SQL to do it. And so now what we see a challenge is to be a little bit slightly towards that model, but slightly different. Folks that we see today, customers want to access that same kind of data on object storage systems now, what I call object storage systems. And so we looked at the Polybase model with things like ODBC drivers, and we said, you know what, that might not be the right way forward, even though we still support that. So we want to support the same constructs as Open Row Set, external tables, and something called Create External Table as Select. That's a mouthful, CTOS. That's pretty cool, though, because then you can go create files in different systems based on select statements. We want to support those SQL constructs, but we want to use REST API calls now to do it. And we're going to put that inside the SQL engine, so it's very lightweight. So you don't need those Polybase services anymore with ODBC drivers to access sources because these sources are typically not ODBC driver based. They're typically accessed through REST API calls, things like Azure Blob Storage, Azure Data Lake Storage, or even S3 providers. And we know because you have data lakes out there, you want to access things like Parquet and Delta. And you don't even want to tell SQL Server the format. You're like, hey, here's a Parquet file. Parquet's got the schema in it. I'm not even going to tell you the format. Why don't you just go give me back the results, not the data, and show it to me as an external table? And so we're now supporting Parquet and Delta, which are two of the most common formats out there to store data in lakes. Now, once we do that, we open up this entire world for you, whether it's Azure Storage or Azure Data Lake Storage, but look at all these S3 providers. I recently presented this topic to somebody and they said, oh, I thought S3 was just an Amazon thing. Well, it certainly started there, but it's an open protocol. So this is just a handful of the providers out there in the industry that have object storage systems that are opening up the world for you with S3. And so we thought to ourselves, well, if we're going to use this S3 protocol and it's REST, why can't we do backups that way? So now you can do a backup or restore from any of these S3 providers as well. And so again, a lot of these partners of ours out there are pretty excited about this because they know you're using their technology for object storage. So if you kind of now look at our model for Polybase and data virtualization, it kind of looks like this. You can use the Polybase services that we launched in, say, SQL 19 to access these types of resources in your environment, or you can use the new connectors. But notice you're using the same SQL syntax to do it, which is pretty cool because you can now start joining Parquet files sitting on an S3 server somewhere with your query to Oracle with your local SQL server. That's really what happens when you have the power of data virtualization. So very excited to see this technology land. It's not heralded as much as some of our major big features doing the engine and with our cloud connectivity, but we think that opens up a big new world for you and customers who don't always have their data stored inside SQL Server. So Ajay, we did 4 of the wheels of power. We did cloud connected, built-in query intelligence, meat and potatoes, and data virtualization. I think you should talk a little bit about what we've done in the T-SQL space.
Yeah, absolutely. T-SQL is core for the product. It is how a lot of customers interact with the product. People who are very well-versed in programming languages and know that T-SQL is one of the simplest languages to use. And one of the biggest feedback we get from customers is a challenge that is listed here is they want to leverage all the new capabilities that we see in SQL Server through the T-SQL language because it's simple and easy to use and don't have to learn yet another language to have to manage the product. So in this release, we extend T-SQL to help the developer administration experience. The first category of features is in the JSON space. More and more, we hear from customers that data is not just pure rows and columns, but they also have data which is stored in JSON format. So we have native JSON support, and they have functions now available, such as JSON object and JSON array, which will help them interact with these database data types, as well as validate if incoming data is of that JSON type. The next category of features, the T-SQL functions. Several of these functions are manipulating string functions, window functions, etc. And a lot of customers have given feedback through user voice, through community, or even sometimes direct asks. And some of the most popular and highly voted items that you see here are listed in the T-SQL bucket of features. And then the last category is all the time series functions. We introduced Azure SQL Edge a couple of years back, which is very common scenario when you're doing IoT type, like streaming data coming into the database, and several windowing and time series functions to store and manipulate this data. So customers want to use SQL in those scenarios, like an ingestion scenario, and being able to use time series functions on those. So we are bringing the same experience to SQL Server with SQL Server 2022, as you can see here. So now we covered all the 5 buckets in the wheel of power. Let me quickly summarize what we talked about today. We started with the cloud journey, how we are bringing the value that we have innovated in the cloud for last decade, literally, by bringing some of these Azure-enabled features through managed instance, Synapse Link, Purview, Azure Active Directory, etc. And you can get all these benefits right from within your SQL Server by interacting with Azure Arc and in some cases directly. The second wheel in the wheel of power is the built-in query intelligence. Here we strive to solve the problem of query tuning and performance with no app or code changes, which is our core principle that the team takes on as a challenge. And you saw that through the next generation of investments in IQP as well as Query Store, we are bringing solving problems for some of the most common use cases such as DOP feedback, kernelity estimation, and parameter sniffing. The third category, security. Bob talked briefly about Ledger, but we also touched on some of the features in Always Encrypted, in the scalability of high-end systems such as buffer pool, parallel scan, TempDB contention. In the availability space, we talked about contained availability groups as well as the Intel Quick Access Backup feature. And then Bob dove about data virtualization, object storage, how you can now access data easily from SQL Server with SQL interfaces on data residing in other storage formats like a data lake, S3, etc. And finally, I shared some of the new updates coming to the T-SQL language to improve the developer experience. So a lot of content. We went on a lightning speed and gave you a drive through of all the features. But don't worry, there's a lot more content available for you to learn and understand through this event and through our various other resources. So here's a list of other sessions related to SQL Server that we have at DPS, whether you're running SQL Server in virtual machines, how to get the best performance out of it, whether you are trying to migrate to Azure, how do you use all the tools, whether you want a deeper dive on some of these core engine features, query processing, storage engine, etc. Or if you want to use our Arc-enabled SQL, and finally, if you want to look at some of the security features, you can take a look at any of these sessions that are listed here along with the speakers. Several of these members will be happy to engage with you and answer questions during those sessions also. And we look forward to using SQL Server 2022. And Bob, how do people get access to the product and what are other resources available?
Well, heck, I think you could just go watch all of the recordings and you'd know everything we all know. I mean, I was just looking through that lineup. I'm not sure I've seen that lineup yet before. And I'm thinking all of our team members are doing that. Just a huge call out to them for building all those recordings. That is a treasure trove of deep information about what we've built. If you want to learn more just about the product and keep up to date with the release itself, this is your main website to go to. But you probably want to you're probably on right now watching this going, I haven't downloaded it yet. We're in release candidate mode right now. Just go here and you can download the bits and start using them right now. Or you can go to the Azure the Azure Virtual Machine Marketplace and get an evaluation edition. The deck you see right now is here. And as we move towards general availability, we're going to take some of our public decks and we're going to keep them right there for you. We're open source presenters. So if you got a public deck out there, you can use it yourself to present to your Saturday group or your user group. And then this is a great resource right here. This is where you go to get the latest on the docs. Mike Ray and the doc team have worked tirelessly to make sure that we're up to date on what's all new in the product. I've spent some time in GitHub. This is my GitHub repo. I've tried to go through some of those features we've talked about today. There's a bunch of them now out there I've got. And these are like basic step-by-step instructions for how you can go through yourself and try out some of this functionality. I was able to do last year, I can't believe it's all back to last year, Microsoft Mechanics video about SQL Server 2022. Said like 60,000 views. And I can't believe that. And I thought more about it. It's really got some pretty cool deep dives about what we've been talking today. Some demos that you probably haven't seen yet or seen today. And then who hasn't heard of Anna Hoffman and the famous Data Exposed? I think she did a live one here at Data Platform Summit. There's a series on SQL Server 2022 that they have specifically in Data Exposed. You can see that. And then this really is the treasure trove. So all the folks you saw in those sessions right there, a lot of the program managers have been working on a blogging series. We've got a lot of them out there now, and there's going to be a lot more to come. So these are more taking each feature from their perspective, working with the engineering team and showing you more deep dive about what this feature is, why we built it, kind of pointers and demos, that kind of type thing. So keep in touch as a feature by feature basis with what's going on in our blog series. So Ajay, I'm going to leave this up here as a slide because people still probably want to see these things. And what I'm going to do is we want to stop and see, I think, if there are final questions. But first, I'm going to start the question, Ajay, because I'm going to put you on the spot. Since you're leading the SQL Server team, we just released a release candidate of SQL Server 2022 preview. So when is this thing going to go generally available?
Great question. That's the most common question we get more than any other feature is when is the product coming generally available? Right now, we are still working on some of the details and we will hold true to the name of the product, which is 22 in its name. So it is coming soon this year. Stay tuned and we will share more details when we are ready to make the announcement.
Well, folks, I tried here live on the air to get Ajay to reveal this. So people have tried to get me as well, Ajay. So well done. Good job doing that. Now, the other question I have is this. Somebody may be seeing these features and want to know which one's in standard edition or what's one in enterprise edition or what's licensing like or pricing like. Like, when is that going to be shared?
Yeah, those are some of the critical details we're working through along with various features to decide on what are the pricing models, what are the purchasing models, which features will be available in which edition, etc. But
Okay.
release candidate is equivalent to enterprise edition. So this is a great time to try for free every single feature, no matter what SKU you're using, and get familiar with it. So it'll help you.
Yeah, I would say, Ajay, this is, I mean, when you're at release candidate time, you're close, right?
Correct. Right.
Yeah. Okay. Good.
And we are,
Well, I
we are
tried,
also
folks.
close from a calendar year perspective. Not many months left in the year.
I think we would lose our job if we don't make this name, right?
Yeah, we are always held to the name, so that I'm very confident.
Okay.
Yeah.
We'll all lose our jobs otherwise. We don't want to lose our jobs, so we're going to make it. So hey, we got a few minutes left. We have all these amazing experts who've probably answered a billion questions for us. Thank you a million times. Dave, Perry, Kevin, thank you so much for going to answer those questions for us. Is there anything out there that you guys on the call want to throw out to the chat window that Ajay and I should tackle before we're done for today? I'm waiting. I'm looking at the chat window, just seeing if there's anything out there that's pressing. They probably answered all the questions already, Ajay.
Yeah.
Awesome. Oh, here we go. Nothing coming. Not for me. See, they already answered everything. They're so smart. Folks, I'll tell you what, Ajay, thank you, Ajay, for doing this with me today. I really, really appreciate it. People don't know this. Ajay, I love telling personal stories about people. Ajay is remote, moving his son into college. So he's got this emotional moment with he and his wife where they're taking their older son and moving him into college as a freshman. So Ajay, we all feel for you. I know that's a big moment to take and move your child to college. Thanks for doing this and staying up so late. And thank all of you worldwide for joining us live here, wherever you are right now to listen to us. Hopefully you also get to see this on demand. The Data Platform Summit is a very important event for the community, for Microsoft, and for all of you. And so thank you, the Data Platform Summit team, for once again hosting a great event. There's a lot more coming in this event. So thank you so much for all you do for the community. And we will sign off now. Thanks again. Have a great day, evening, morning, wherever you are.
Yeah, thank you, folks. It's been my pleasure to be back at this summit for yet another year, and looking forward to everyone trying out the product and giving us the feedback.